The Paramount lot shimmered in that particular California gold that only existed in the late afternoon of 1965, when dreams were still printed on celluloid and hope smelled like fresh coffee and Lucky Strikes. Stage 12 hummed with the controlled chaos of a Matt Helm picture, Dean Martin's latest vehicle in a franchise that was minting money faster than the Treasury. The orchestra was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody in rehearsal, and even though it wasn't a performance, the musicians straightened in their chairs when Dean walked in. The lighting crew stopped arguing about gels. A secretary carrying memos paused in the doorway and simply watched, because Dean Martin had arrived, and even when it wasn't showtime, it felt like magic. He stood in his effortless uniform, tailored suit, loosened tie, that trademark half-smile that suggested he'd just heard the world's best joke and decided to keep it to himself. The martini glass in his hand held apple juice, though the world insisted it was gin. Around him, the machine of Hollywood ground forward, assistants shouting about call times, extras adjusting costumes, and somewhere in the background, that piano player running through melodies that would soon make teenage girls swoon from coast to coast. The air was thick with the easy, rolling laughter of a man who seemed to own the world, yet carried himself like he'd borrowed it and might give it back at any moment. Then Marcus Rothman arrived like thunder in a silent film. The studio executive stormed onto the set with 3 nervous assistants trailing behind him like apostles of anxiety. His face was already red with whatever grievance had brought him there, his gold watch catching the studio lights as he gestured with hands that had never known honest work. Rothman had built his career on intimidation, on making grown men feel small, on reminding everyone that art was just commerce wearing a tuxedo. He was the new breed of Hollywood executive, corporate, cruel, bottom-line focused, everything that Dean's old-school handshake deal world was slowly losing to. The music stopped. The laughter died. Even the California sunshine seemed to dim. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds would echo through Hollywood corridors for the next 50 years. Rothman approached a young lighting assistant, Tommy Breslin, barely 22, who'd made some minor mistake with a gel filter. The executive's voice rose above the sudden silence, each word a small act of violence. He called the kid incompetent, worthless. Then, when Tommy tried to apologize, tried to explain, Rothman crossed a line that even Hollywood's brutal hierarchy rarely dared to cross. He raised his hand and slapped the young man across the face, hard enough that the sound cracked through the soundstage like a gunshot. The room held its breath. 100 people became statues. This was 1965, where studio executives were gods and crew members were disposable, where speaking up meant never working again, where silence was survival. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, resigned to the way things were. They knew Dean's history. Kid Crochet from Steubenville, the welterweight who'd fought his way out of steel mills and card rooms. The violence was right there, simmering beneath the tuxedo, a heavy burden of rage that Dean had spent a lifetime learning to suppress. Then Dean Martin set down his glass. The movement was so casual, so unhurried, that it seemed choreographed. He walked across the stage with that same easy grace that made everything look effortless, the singing, the acting, the living. But anyone who truly knew him could see something different in his eyes now, something that had nothing to do with the cool cat persona, something ancient and immovable, forged in the steel mills of Steubenville and tempered by a lifetime of watching powerful men hurt powerless ones. This wasn't about his ego. This was about dignity, about the unspoken code he'd carried since childhood. He stopped directly in front of Marcus Rothman. The executive was still breathing hard, still riding the adrenaline of his own cruelty. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. When he spoke, every person on that soundstage leaned in to hear what the King of Cool would say to the man who'd just committed an unforgivable act. What came next wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was something far more devastating. It was a man drawing a line in the sand with the quiet authority of someone who'd never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. "You're done here," Dean said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not just on this picture. In this town. Pick up your things and leave." What followed would not make the papers. It would not be spun into a studio-approved anecdote or folded into his public legend as another charming Rat Pack escapade. But from this quiet, razor-sharp moment, a single, calm stand in a room full of cowards, a man's career would end, and another man's true character would be revealed. Decades later, a grandson would open an old shoebox and find a yellowing photo. His grandfather, young and shaken, standing just behind Dean Martin on that very set. On the back, in fading ink, 4 simple words: "He didn't look away." Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to 1965, to a soundstage where one moment of quiet courage changed Hollywood forever. There were always 2 Dean Martins, and if you don't understand that fundamental split, you'll never comprehend what really happened when Marcus Rothman raised his hand on that soundstage in 1965. The first Dean Martin was the one America fell in love with, the crooner who seemed to float through life on a cloud of cigarette smoke and bourbon-scented charm. This was the man who showed up to rehearsals fashionably late, flashing that lazy grin that suggested he'd just awakened from the world's most pleasant dream. He forgot his lines on live television and turned the mistakes into punchlines that had audiences roaring. He cultivated an image of magnificent indifference, as if nothing in the entire universe could possibly matter enough to disturb his perfect equilibrium. This Dean Martin was the drunk who never stumbled, the clown who never tried, the cool cat who made effort itself seem almost embarrassing. But beneath that carefully polished surface lived another man entirely, one forged in the blast furnaces of Steubenville, Ohio, where dreams came with calluses and hope spoke in broken English. That man had been born Dino Crocetti, son of an Italian immigrant barber who worked 16-hour days in a shop that smelled of talc and desperate ambition. Young Dino didn't speak English until he was 5, struggled through school because words on paper never made the same sense that rhythm and melody did in his bones. He left education behind in 10th grade, not from laziness, but from necessity. His family needed him to work, needed his hands in the steel mills where men lost fingers to the machinery and sometimes their lives to the heat. In those mills, dealing blackjack in smoke-filled back rooms, learning to box because in Steubenville you either learned to fight or learned to take a beating, Dino discovered the fundamental truth that would shape everything that followed. The world was divided into people with power and people without it, and the difference between them could be as simple as who had to ask permission and who never did. They called him Kid Crochet in the ring, and his hands carried the permanent evidence, broken knuckles that ached on rainy days, calluses that never quite faded, the physical memory of a time when violence was the primary language of survival. But boxing taught him something more valuable than how to throw a punch. It taught him that the loudest fighter was rarely the strongest, that real power lived in restraint, in the devastating ability to hold back when every instinct screamed to swing. The transformation from Dino Crocetti to Dean Martin wasn't magic, it was architecture. He built his persona brick by careful brick, constructing a fortress designed to protect something fragile underneath. He learned that if you let the world believe you didn't care about anything, it would consistently underestimate you. And being underestimated was the greatest advantage a poor Italian kid could possess. The drunk act, the casual indifference, the effortless charm, these weren't personality traits. They were survival mechanisms, carefully calibrated to disarm those who might otherwise see him as a threat. Let them think he was just a lovable lush who stumbled into success. Let them believe the talent was accidental, the success undeserved. Meanwhile, behind those hooded eyes that seemed to notice nothing, He was cataloging everything. By 1965, Dean Martin had achieved the impossible dream of every immigrant's child. He had transcended the limitations of his birth, become somebody, made it all the way to the top. But success had never erased the memory of powerlessness. He still carried the image of that steel mill foreman screaming at his father in English the old man couldn't fully understand. Still felt the casino boss's threats to break his dealing hands. Still remembered every small humiliation that came with being nobody from nowhere. And that memory would prove to be Marcus Rothman's undoing. It happened like damaged film running through a broken projector, each frame burning itself into memory with terrifying clarity. Marcus Rothman's hand rose in a perfect arc, his heavy gold signet ring catching the harsh studio lights and throwing a cruel flash across stage 12. The sound that followed wasn't theatrical, it was something wet and brutal that cracked through the air like a gunshot, sharp enough that one of the grips would later swear he felt it in his teeth. On Tommy Breslin's young face, a red mark began to bloom instantly, spreading like humiliation made visible, a brand that would never quite fade from anyone's memory. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. 100 people seemed to inhale simultaneously and then forget how to exhale, their collective breath held in a paralysis so complete that the script supervisor would later swear she could hear traffic on Melrose Avenue ghosting through the soundproofed walls. It was the silence of witnesses, the terrible quiet that follows when something unforgivable happens and no one knows how to respond. Tommy stood frozen, shock written plainly across his features like words on a page. The most heartbreaking part wasn't the fear in his eyes, but the shame burning there brighter than any studio light. His hands trembled as he reached up instinctively, then stopped, afraid that even touching his own face might be considered another mistake. The tears gathered at the corners of his eyes as he did what powerless people have done since the beginning of time. He began to apologize. I'm sorry, Mr. Rothman. The word stumbled out, automatic. A lifetime reflex that said if something bad happened, it must somehow be your fault. He was blinking rapidly, fighting desperately not to let the tears fall, not to give Rothman the satisfaction, not to cry in front of 100 people who would remember. Rothman's reaction was almost worse than the slap itself. He didn't look remorseful or even angry anymore. He looked satisfied, drunk on the adrenaline of his own dominance. He turned away from Tommy with dismissive ease, adjusting his cufflink as if discarding a used tissue, already scanning the room for his next target, his next opportunity to remind everyone who held the power. In his mind, the scene was finished, the lesson delivered, order restored. Around them, the calculations began in split seconds behind careful masks. The assistant director felt the words rising in his throat. Stop. Enough. You can't do this. But then pictured his mortgage, his kids' school tuition, the career he'd spent 20 years building. The cinematographer stared at his shoes, remembering other sets, other men like Rothman, knowing exactly what happened to people who intervened. The extras looked away because looking was dangerous, because witnessing made you complicit, because powerless people survive by becoming invisible. But Dean Martin wasn't calculating. He was remembering. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His father in that steel mill, the foreman screaming in English the old man couldn't fully understand, the way his father's shoulders had curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller. Every lesson he'd learned about restraint, about the performance of indifference, burned away in the face of that red mark on Tommy Breslin's face. The boxer's instinct rose through years of careful control, but this wasn't about violence. Violence was easy. Violence was what Rothman understood. This was about something far more devastating. Dean set his glass down with deliberate, terrifying care, the tiny click somehow audible in the frozen room. Then he began to walk, not rushed, not theatrical, just that same unhurried stride that made everything look effortless. But everyone who knew him could see the difference, could sense that something fundamental had shifted. His hands stayed loose at his sides, because this wasn't about fists. This was about authority. Rothman noticed Dean approaching, confusion flickering across his face followed by dismissive amusement. Even Dean Martin wouldn't dare challenge the studio's power structure. Even the king of cool knew his place. Then Dean stopped inches away, invading Rothman's space with casual intimacy that was more threatening than any scream. When Dean spoke, his voice was so calm it was almost conversational, stripped of all the slur and slang of his stage persona. "You're done here. Not just on this picture. In this town. Pick up your things and leave." Rothman started to bluster, contracts, studio bosses, consequences, but the words died when he looked into Dean's eyes and saw something ancient and immovable staring back. This wasn't the cool cat from television. This was Kid Crochet from Steubenville, and he'd drawn a line that wouldn't be crossed. The room began to move again, people slowly straightening from their frozen positions, the collective realization spreading that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Rothman's exit wasn't dramatic, it was pathetic. The powerful man suddenly diminished, walking toward the soundstage door while his assistants scattered like startled birds, abandoning him to his fate. Dean turned to Tommy Breslin with unexpected gentleness, his voice dropping to something private and kind. Whatever he said in those quiet moments restored something that the slap had tried to steal. Then he instructed the assistant director to resume filming as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. 30 minutes later, the telephone rang. The studio head's voice crackled through the line, demanding to know what had just happened on stage 12. Dean's response was simple, devastating, and would either cement his legend or destroy everything he'd built. "I just did what you should have done years ago." By the time the sun slipped behind the Hollywood Hills that evening, telephones were ringing in paneled boardrooms from Beverly Hills to Burbank, the machinery of power grinding into motion. With practiced urgency, studio executives gathered around polished conference tables, their faces tight with calculation and barely controlled panic. Lawyers arrived with armfuls of contracts, dropping them in heavy stacks that thudded against ancient wood like small verdicts. The question hanging in the air was simple and terrifying. How do you contain a man who refuses to be contained? The pressure campaign against Dean began within hours. Rothman's allies reached out with voices dripping false concern, reminding Dean of contract obligations, of the millions riding on the Matt Helm franchise, of how many people depended on him to be reasonable. These were men who'd spent careers intimidating others into submission, who believed everyone had a price or a pressure point. The threats were veiled but unmistakable: breach of contract, financial ruin, the destruction of everything he'd built. Dean's response unsettled them more than defiance would have. He didn't argue or justify or negotiate. He simply listened with that same maddening calm, occasionally offering a soft "I understand" before hanging up. It was the response of a man who'd already made his decision and found peace in it, who understood exactly what cards he held. This wasn't the easygoing lush they'd expected to intimidate. This was Kid Crochet from Steubenville, and he'd stared down pit bosses in illegal gambling dens when he was barely 20. When the inevitable meeting with the studio head took place, Dean laid out his position with devastating simplicity. Either Marcus Rothman left Hollywood permanently, or Dean walked. And with Dean went the Matt Helm franchise printing money, the television variety show dominating Thursday nights, the recording contracts producing chart-topping hits, the entire empire built on his name. There was no anger in his delivery, just a statement of fact delivered with the same casual ease he used to order lunch. In boardrooms across the city, the calculation began in earnest. Accountants ran numbers, lawyers reviewed contracts, executives weighed Dean's value against Rothman's. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Dean Martin represented hundreds of millions in current and future revenue. Marcus Rothman, for all his connections, was ultimately replaceable. The uncomfortable truth emerged like a bone through broken skin. In this equation, talent trumped executive authority. Then something unexpected happened. With Rothman's protection suddenly uncertain, other voices began emerging from the shadows. A script supervisor mentioned an incident from 2 years earlier. A makeup artist recalled being screamed at until she vomited. The investigation that followed was quiet, conducted by studio lawyers more interested in limiting liability than seeking justice. But what they found was damning. Rothman's cruelty wasn't isolated. It was a pattern spanning years and multiple productions, systematically enabled because he delivered projects on budget and knew how to play the political game. The complicity was staggering. Memos surfaced from filing cabinets, complaints that had been received and dismissed with bureaucratic efficiency. Human resources had documented incidents and done nothing. The system hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as designed, protecting profit over people. Rothman's desperate attempts to salvage his career became increasingly pathetic. He called old friends who suddenly didn't answer their phones. Meetings got canceled with transparent excuses. The realization came slowly. Then all at once, he'd been excommunicated from the only world he'd ever known. Across the industry, subtle shifts began. On sets where Dean worked, crew members noticed less screaming, more respect, a new wariness about crossing certain lines. Years later, a grip would say simply, he made it possible to say no. You can't do that, and not be fired on the spot. That's not nothing. Dean himself never discussed the incident publicly. When reporters asked, he deflected with jokes, maintained his cool persona, treated the whole thing as if it had never happened. The paradox was perfect. He'd just wielded enormous power, but did it in a way that suggested power itself was nothing, that standing up for someone was simply what any decent person would do. But there was a cost, invisible but real. Invitations from certain circles stopped coming. Friendships with other executives cooled perceptibly. Dean had broken the ultimate code of Hollywood's elite. He had sided with the help against the masters, proven he couldn't be controlled. In the high towers of Hollywood, there is no sin greater than being a man who remembers where he came from. The thing about the Rothman incident is that people who really knew Dean weren't surprised. Shocked by the bluntness of it, maybe, but not surprised. Because that moment on stage 12 wasn't an anomaly, it was simply the one time his private code became public spectacle, a flash of lightning that briefly illuminated a secret underground railroad of kindness he'd been operating his entire life. Back in 1962, there was a showgirl named Catherine working at the Sands in Las Vegas, beautiful in that fragile, late-night way, heavy makeup covering the purple shadows under her eyes, big dreams shrinking under the weight of a reality she hadn't bargained for. She was trapped in a relationship with a casino owner whose jealousy had turned violent, a man who treated women like poker chips to be collected and controlled. Dean noticed her one night between shows, and it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention. He was surrounded by beauty every night. It was the way she flinched when the casino owner placed a hand on her shoulder, the way her laugh came half a second too late, like an actress who'd forgotten her line. Over the next few weeks, he watched. The bruises that makeup couldn't quite hide. The way she never met anyone's eyes. The way the pit bosses looked away because it wasn't their business. Then one Tuesday morning, Catherine simply disappeared from the casino floor. A week later, a quiet little life began in Los Angeles. A modest apartment with first and last month's rent mysteriously paid. A receptionist job at a talent agency that appeared out of nowhere. A car with keys and a note that said, "Only go." There were no dramatic confrontations, no threats, no scenes. Just a carefully orchestrated vanishing act that saw the showgirl re-emerge as a woman with choices again. The casino owner's threats evaporated when he received a quiet visit from men who made it clear that pursuing her would be unwise. Dean never asked for gratitude, never mentioned it again, never expected anything in return. 6 years later, the pattern repeated in a different form. During a television taping in July 1968, the studio air conditioning had failed, and an elderly extra named Walter, a character actor who'd worked in Hollywood since the silent era, was visibly struggling in the brutal heat, layered in a heavy wool coat for a winter scene. His face was flushed dangerously red, his hand reaching for a nearby chair that wasn't there. The assistant director had noticed but kept filming because the schedule was tight and extras were expendable. Dean simply stopped mid-joke, stepped off his mark, crossed the stage, and put a hand on Walter's arm just as his knees began to buckle. Production halted. Medical staff were called. When the studio protested about the budget implications, Dean's response was quiet but absolute. "Then take it out of my salary." Walter was paid for the full day despite being unable to continue. After Dean died in 1995, the true scope of his invisible life began to surface like a shipwreck rising from the deep, stories flooding out like water from a broken dam. His children discovered boxes in his study containing thank you letters he'd never mentioned, photographs with people they'd never heard of. There were struggling musicians whose rent he'd paid for years during lean times, crew members whose medical bills he'd covered when insurance fell short, families he'd supported through tragedies he'd somehow learned about and never discussed. A jazz pianist wrote that Dean had quietly funded his recovery from tuberculosis for 18 months. A gaffer's widow described how an anonymous check arrived every month for 2 years after her husband died on set, keeping her family housed and fed. Most shocking was the scholarship fund nobody knew existed. For decades, a trust administered by his accountant had sent children of service workers and crew members to college, the paperwork carefully structured to keep Dean's name hidden from recipients. 43 people received educations they couldn't have afforded otherwise, and not one of them knew who'd made it possible until after he was gone. All the while, Dean fed a very different story to the public, encouraging tales about being lazy and indifferent, deflecting any suggestion that he cared deeply about anything with a joke and a shrug. The contrast was deliberate and carefully maintained. If everyone thought you were drunk and detached, they didn't look too closely at where you went when you slipped out the back door. Jerry Lewis would admit decades after their partnership ended that he'd completely misunderstood Dean, mistaking his quiet compassion for coldness, his depth for detachment, his restraint for indifference. "I thought he didn't care," Lewis said in an interview near the end of his own life, his voice thick with regret. "Turns out he cared more than any of us. He just knew that caring out loud made you vulnerable." Frank Sinatra recognized something in Dean that the rest of the Rat Pack lacked. In private conversations, Frank called Dean the conscience we never deserved, acknowledging a moral compass he himself struggled to match. Sinatra's generosity was public and theatrical. He wanted credit for his kindness. Dean's was private and anonymous. He wanted only the act itself to matter. When Dean's children finally went through his personal effects, they found boxes of letters written in looping, emotional handwriting, thank you notes from widows, musicians, stagehands, waitresses, stories of rent paid, funerals covered, kids sent to school. His second wife, Jean Martin, described how Dean would disappear for hours without explanation. She assumed he was golfing or playing cards. It was only years later she learned he'd been visiting sick crew members in hospitals, sitting quietly with grieving families, attending funerals of people he'd worked with decades earlier, often the only celebrity in a room full of working-class mourners. The pattern was unmistakable and haunting. Dean's interventions always happened in darkness, without cameras, without witnesses, without publicity. The help mattered infinitely more than the credit. The act meant everything, the applause meant nothing. This was the architecture of his life, a constant tension between the lazy drunk he played in public and the deeply sensitive man who couldn't sleep if he knew someone was suffering. But there is a quiet burden that comes with seeing what others don't, or won't. Dean couldn't unsee the pain, couldn't unknow the imbalance of power he'd escaped. He carried the responsibility of his position like a private cross, always the one who stood up, who couldn't look away, who couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. There is a terrible loneliness in being different in a town built on looking the other way, in being the one who cannot ignore the pain of others. And in the stillness of his later years, as friends drifted away and losses mounted, a question began to echo in the spaces fame couldn't fill. Had all this standing up, all this seeing and carrying, been worth the particular kind of isolation that came with being the only man in the room who refused to be a bystander? Had his success been worth the loneliness of being different, of being the one who couldn't just go along, who carried the weight of everyone else's pain as if it were his own? March 21st, 1987, was the day the mask finally shattered beyond repair. The phone call came like a blade through silence. Dean Paul Martin's F-4 Phantom fighter jet had vanished into a California mountain during what should have been a routine training exercise. When they found the wreckage scattered across the snow-covered peaks, Dean's beloved son, his Dino, the golden boy who'd inherited his father's easy smile and his mother's quiet strength, was gone. It was the call every parent fears. The nightmare that confirms your worst paranoia wasn't paranoia at all, but premonition. In that single, merciless moment, something fundamental inside Dean Martin, the man who'd survived poverty, violence, heartbreak, and 40 years of relentless public scrutiny, finally broke beyond his ability to hide it. The grief that followed was catastrophic and absolute. For 4 decades, Dean had worn his mask with almost supernatural discipline, the effortless smile, the lazy quips, the carefully practiced indifference that suggested the world could throw anything at him and he'd just shrug and order another drink. But this kind of loss respects no persona, acknowledges no performance. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated entirely. Dean withdrew from public life with an abruptness that shocked an industry accustomed to his reliability. Performances were canceled without explanation. The television show went dark. Nightclub dates evaporated from his calendar. He stopped returning calls, stopped pretending that nothing could touch him, stopped being the Dean Martin the world thought it knew. Friends who visited his Beverly Hills home found a man they'd never seen before, raw, broken, sitting for hours staring at photographs, unable to summon even the ghost of that famous smile. But in those dark months that stretched into darker years, something remarkable began to happen. The people who came to his door weren't the celebrities you'd expect at a star's threshold. They were crew members from sets decades past, extras who'd worked a single day on a Matt Helm picture, assistants whose names most stars never bothered to learn. The invisible army whose lives he'd quietly touched over the years began arriving, one by one, returning now to offer comfort to the man who'd comforted them when the world looked away. A gaffer whose son's medical bills Dean had covered in 1971 showed up with homemade soup and stayed until Dean at least pretended to eat. A lighting technician who'd lost his own child years earlier sat with Dean for entire afternoons without speaking, just 2 fathers who understood a language that had no words. A makeup artist whose house fire Dean had helped rebuild brought flowers every week and asked for nothing in return. They kept vigils that had nothing to do with fame or cameras or public relations. They sat with him in the heavy silence he now preferred, bringing food he wouldn't eat but appreciated anyway. They didn't offer platitudes or try to manufacture cheer. They simply offered presence, the same quiet, steady presence he'd given them in their darkest moments. The circle of protection was closing around the protector, and it was made up entirely of people whose names had never appeared on a marquee, but whose lives had been changed by a man who remembered what it felt like to be forgotten. While Dean was surrounded by this unexpected love, his old adversary was finishing his own descent into irrelevance and bitterness. Marcus Rothman had spent his final years consumed by rage, blaming Dean for his downfall, never understanding that he'd destroyed himself the moment he raised his hand on that soundstage 24 years earlier. He drifted through cheap lunches at second-rate restaurants, nursing his resentment like a drink that never emptied, pitching comeback projects to executives who remembered him only as a cautionary tale. When he died in 1989, virtually unnoticed, his passing merited only a brief mention in the trades. His funeral was sparsely attended. No one from the industry he'd once dominated bothered to come. It was the final, brutal confirmation that power without integrity is ultimately worthless, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint echo of old cruelties. Meanwhile, Hollywood was slowly beginning to understand what Dean had actually done all those years ago. Retrospectives in the late 80s and early 90s started mentioning not just his performances, but the culture he'd created on his sets, the way he treated crew members, the standard he'd expected from everyone around him. Directors like Steven Spielberg and actors like Tom Hanks began citing the Rothman incident in interviews, sometimes as a story they'd heard, sometimes as a moral compass that had influenced their own approach to power and responsibility. Film schools started teaching it as a case study in leadership. The moment when Dean Martin ended an executive's career for slapping a young man became a whispered legend, A reminder that talent didn't excuse cruelty. That power came with an obligation to protect those who had none. In 2003, a small documentary team researching Hollywood's golden age tracked down an elderly man living quietly in the San Fernando Valley. Tommy Breslin's hair had gone white, and his hands shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. But when he began describing that afternoon in 1965, the years fell away like old paint. His voice broke as he remembered the heat in his cheek, the silence that followed the slap, the way 100 people had simultaneously held their breath. Then his eyes filled with tears as he recalled Dean's hand on his shoulder, steady and warm, and the words that had become the philosophy of his entire career. Nobody gets to make you small. Not in my house. Not ever. Those words had traveled with him as he rose to become one of Hollywood's most respected cinematographers, a code he passed to every young person who worked under him. Dean's legacy spreading through generations like ripples in still water. Dean's final years carried the particular loneliness that comes with being the last of your generation. The Rat Pack had scattered to the winds, Sammy gone in 1990, Frank fading into his own twilight battles. The grief over Dean Paul never fully healed. It simply became part of the permanent landscape he inhabited, a shadow he carried everywhere. His body was betraying him, his memory sometimes failing, but the visitors kept coming. A former showgirl with gray in her hair, who hugged him a little too long. A middle-aged man with a college degree paid for by a scholarship he'd never known was Dean's doing. Grips and drivers and waitresses with stories of rent paid, funerals covered, kindnesses offered in darkness, and never mentioned again. On Christmas Day 1995, Dean Martin died quietly in his sleep, and his funeral revealed the truth of his life more eloquently than any biography ever could. Yes, there were celebrities in the pews. Frank was there, frail but present, along with other names the world would recognize. But the church was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with people whose names had never appeared on a screen, crew members who'd worked with him 40 years earlier, makeup artists and script supervisors, service workers whose children he'd sent to college, hotel staff who'd known him as the man who always asked about their families. They filled every seat and lined the walls. The forgotten faces of Hollywood gathered to say goodbye to the one famous man who had never forgotten them. The eulogy spoke of his talent, his charm, his place in entertainment history. But the real testament was in the faces of the mourners, ordinary people whose lives had been quietly, permanently changed by a man who understood that true power meant using your strength to shield others from the very pain you'd once endured yourself. After the funeral, as his daughter Deanna sorted through the accumulated artifacts of her father's life, she found something that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the King of Cool. Hidden in the back of his desk drawer beneath old contracts and forgotten photographs was an envelope yellowed at the edges and addressed in his unmistakable handwriting, "For my kids, when I'm gone." Inside was a letter that would finally reveal, in Dean's own words, why he had lived the way he did, what the mask had really been for, and what he hoped his legacy would actually be. Not the drunk, not the clown, not the cool cat who didn't care about anything, but something far more profound and infinitely more human. The letter began with a confession that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew Dean Martin. The drunk was armor. He wrote in careful, deliberate handwriting. Making everything look easy was the hardest work I ever did. I let people think I didn't care because caring too much, caring the way I actually did, would have broken me in half. So I built a fortress and called it Cool, and I lived inside it for 40 years. The words that followed revealed a philosophy forged in steel mills and refined through decades of watching how power corrupts. Power without compassion is just tyranny with better lighting, he wrote. Success means nothing if you become the kind of person you once feared. The foreman who screamed at my father. The pit boss who threatened my hands. The executives who treated people like furniture. I swore I'd never be them, and that meant using whatever power I had to shield people who had none. That's not heroism. That's just remembering where you came from. The Hollywood Dean knew in 1965 has changed in ways both profound and insufficient. The conversations about power and abuse that have finally reached the mainstream, the reckonings, the systematic dismantling of structures that protected predators, these are discussions Dean was having in private 50 years before they became public. He was decades ahead of his time in understanding that talent doesn't excuse cruelty, that the person holding the boom mic deserves the same dignity as the person in front of the camera. The Dean Martin standard became real in ways he never lived to see. On sets across Hollywood today, there's an unspoken expectation that stars should protect their crews, that power comes with responsibility. Directors like Spielberg and Hanks built reputations partly on treating crews with respect Dean would have recognized. The cultural shift he helped create without ever seeking recognition has become the foundation of how the best people in the industry operate. His children established a foundation in his name that continues the work he did in Shadows, supporting service workers and crew members facing medical crises, funding scholarships for their children, offering emergency assistance when the industry's safety net fails. The work remains anonymous, still focused on the help rather than the credit. Dean would have approved. In 2005, Paramount installed a small brass plaque on stage 12. The inscription is simple: "Here a man stood up." Here everything changed. Dean would have hated the attention, would have made a joke about the cost of the brass, desperate to deflect recognition. Tommy Breslin is in his 80s now, still teaching young cinematographers about light and shadow, but also about dignity and courage. He tells them about the afternoon in 1965, when a studio executive slapped him, and Dean Martin ended the man's career with 6 calm words. He tells them what Dean said afterward: "Nobody gets to make you small. Not in my house. Not ever." He tells them this matters more than any technical skill they'll ever learn. The image of Dean setting down that glass and walking across the soundstage has become frozen in Hollywood mythology, a testament to quiet courage, to the devastating power of restraint over violence. But when we reduce complex people to simple images, the drunk, the clown, the cool cat who didn't care, we lose the profound depth beneath the surface. We miss the struggle, the discipline, the heart. What we gain when we look deeper is the truth of a man who remembered powerlessness with such clarity that he spent his entire life using his power differently. The hero who worked in shadows because the work mattered infinitely more than the recognition. The immigrant's son who never forgot what it felt like to be invisible and made damn sure nobody in his presence ever felt that way again. The final irony is almost too perfect. Dean Martin spent 50 years hiding his best qualities behind a carefully constructed mask of indifference, and only in death did the world discover who he really was. The gentle giant behind the cool facade. The conscience Hollywood never deserved, but desperately needed. So here's what Dean's story asks of us. Look for the people in your own life who stand up quietly, who protect without seeking credit, who use whatever power they have to shield those who have none. Stand up when you see injustice, even when it's easier to look away. Use your power, whatever form it takes, to make someone else's burden lighter. Understand that the coolest thing anyone can ever do is care deeply while making it look effortless. Dean Martin did exactly that for 50 years. His legacy lives on in every crew member treated with dignity, every young person given a chance they couldn't afford, every moment when someone with power chooses to protect rather than dominate. The band stopped playing that afternoon in 1965, but the music Dean started, the quiet song of standing up, of using strength to shield rather than harm, that music plays on, asking you to pick up the melody and carry it forward.